Well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. We've rapidly adapted in a pretty quick way. We ended up getting people working from home, logged in from home, getting them set up with either our laptops or their work stations. So people have brought home their monitors and towers, and so we've got a lot of our staff set up in the past, and so we just had to do that with everybody quite quickly. So we've got everybody able to work from home, everybody set up with video cameras, either with their laptops or their monitors or their phones. And we've had a few tech issues with licenses and some other software problems, but so far so good. And we made it through a super busy month end at the end of March with minimal problems or no problems that we couldn't deal with. So that was definitely great, because that could have been disastrous for a whole bunch of different reasons. With real estate deals, typically time's of the essence, and it's really difficult to be able to extend one transaction, either because the buyer can't complete because they can't get to their bank, or because we had tech problems. Often the seller in that instance has their own deal that they've got to complete, and they need the money from us so that they can turn around and give it to their seller so that their deal doesn't fall apart. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of consequences to make sure deals in British Columbia are closed on time. And so we didn't want to be the missing link that would cause a deal to fall apart.
Yeah, you would have been a lot of pressure on you guys right now, for
Right.
sure. So I know that people always have to sign in person. Do they come to the office? How are you doing? How are you handling that?
No, until a few weeks ago, it had to be in person. Clients had to meet either with us or if they were overseas, and we do have a lot of overseas clients, we would send them to a notary in Hong Kong or Singapore or Seattle, wherever they were. We would just email documents to them. They would print them, sign them in front of the notary, who would witness their signatures, sign a form, kind of a little agreement with us saying that they've done what we've asked them to do in terms of verifying the client's ID and ensuring that they signed the documents properly. So that was fine until a few weeks ago, when all of a sudden nobody could see anybody and people weren't even allowed to leave their homes, or they were sick and didn't want to leave their home. So the Law Society has adapted and changed some of their rules temporarily. Even the Land Title Office, who was a bit slower to respond, has changed their rules in terms of remote witnessing of documents. So now we can actually do something like we're doing now, like a Zoom meeting or FaceTime. And, there's a bunch of policies and procedures that we've got to follow to make sure that, to the best of our knowledge, the client is actually signing the documents and the client is really the client. We've got to review their identification, their signatures. Ideally, we speak with their realtors or mortgage brokers or bankers, somebody that they've met before, some professional who can confirm that, they've checked the same ID that we've checked and the photo of the client looks like them and everything. So, so far, those are the rules. Things obviously seem to be changing on a daily basis. And there's a new policy that comes out. There's a change. Right now, the only real wild card is the bank, the mortgage lender, because, like I said, the Land Title Office is okay with us remotely witnessing Land Title Office documents. Typically, the banks are okay with us, like I said, having an agent witness mortgage documents on our behalf, witness the client signing the mortgage documents on our behalf, like I said, in Hong Kong or Singapore or Seattle. But there's a couple of banks, TD and Scotia in particular, that have required and typically require mortgage documents to be signed in Canada in front of one of the lawyers who's on their list of approved lawyers. So I've talked to a couple of mortgage brokers. They've been having real trouble getting the banks to agree that the client can actually sign these mortgage documents in Australia or wherever they are. Whereas in the past, reasonably, the banks could require the client to come to Canada to sign because they're buying property in Canada, and that's just the bank's rules, and everybody knew what those rules were. Now the clients just can't fly into Canada to sign these documents. And so we're trying to work out getting the banks to allow exemptions or exceptions to their policies in these cases. So I've heard from a couple of brokers that that the banks are. It's a case-by-case basis, and I've heard from a couple of brokers that they're having real trouble getting any kind of approval for this to happen. So, you know, just like anything in this current pandemic, you know, I think everybody has to behave reasonably and try to get business done and deals closed, given the tools that we have. So I'm hoping that the banks will allow us exceptions so that we can make sure these deals get closed, because otherwise it puts the clients, the buyers especially, in the position that they may be in breach of the contract. And then we have to have the seller agree to extend if we can't get the bank to agree that the client can sign in Australia. But you know, even if the seller agrees to extend, you know, we don't know when these travel restrictions are gonna end. It's one thing if a client can't get into our office, you know, because they're at home with COVID, but it's completely another thing if they're stuck, you know, overseas and they just legally and physically have no way of getting here.
Right. What a problem. Oh, so
it is.
That's a big problem. So, okay, so if you're in breach of contract, what does that mean? What happens then?
Well, the worst case scenario is if the seller won't agree to an extension and the buyer and seller can't agree to some sort of compromise. You know, unfortunately, unless something changes drastically and courts just won't accept the seller's termination of the contract because a judge says, listen, you know, you just, in the normal course, sure, you're allowed to accept the buyer's breach of the contract. You can terminate the contract, you can take their deposit, you can sue them for whatever damages you might have. But given what's going on right now, you know, I'm not sure that a judge is going to hold the buyers to the same standards that they would in the normal course in a normal world. You know, they probably would. I wouldn't want to risk it if I was a buyer. I wouldn't want to say to a seller, well, you know, sue me and good luck getting your deposit. No judge is going to be sympathetic to you. That might be true, but I wouldn't want to bet my deposit on it. That's for sure.
There's no precedence, right? This hasn't happened before.
Right. You know, there's no real force majeure clause in real estate contracts, even if there were, and there are in some commercial leases and some other sort of longer term contracts for services. You know, is this pandemic a force majeure that, you know, or an act of God or an act of nature that would allow a buyer to breach? Maybe, but probably not. I mean, there's always solutions. You know, like I was saying, the Land Title Office has relaxed its policies. The Law Society has relaxed its policies. Most of the banks have policies that allow for clients to sign documents remotely. Most banks are allowing clients to, you know, call in to initiate wire transfers rather than attending the branch. RBC seems to be a holdout. RBC's always been the only bank that I know of that sort of has this strict policy of a client has to be in the branch to move money out of their bank account, even if it's to another one of their own bank accounts, and even if it's to their lawyer's trust account to complete a real estate transaction. Wow. So that's, you know, we've had lots of clients in the past who have thought it would be a good idea to wire their purchase funds to their bank account in Canada in anticipation of closing, and then expecting that once we have the final numbers for them and the amount of money we'll need from them to complete the deal, that they'll just, you know, phone up their bank and the bank will transfer money into our trust account at that bank, which, you know, can happen with most of the banks, and especially now, and does seem to happen around the world on a more regular basis. But you know, we typically tell clients, don't wire money or don't transfer money to your own bank account for a purchase, just in case you can't get it out of your bank account and into ours. If you need to get money to Canada because you're concerned about exchange rates, or you just want to get money out of Australia or wherever you are to Canada, just to wire it directly to our trust account rather than than to your own trust, rather than to your own bank account in Canada, just in case it gets stuck there.
What a great idea. That's a great tip. Good one. Thank you. Okay, so you covered digital signatures are allowed somewhat, a couple of banks not. What if, okay, I don't know if you can answer this question. So the buyers remove the subjects, they lose their job. What if the mortgage company says, no, you don't get the mortgage now? What happens then? They lose their deposit, don't they?
They're definitely at risk of losing their deposit. It really depends how sympathetic the seller is. And it's not just the seller's sympathies necessarily that you have to worry about. It's, do they have another deal going on?
Right. Yeah.
And the other issue is, well, you know, if the seller agrees to allow the buyer, you know, some sort of significant extension, you know, till they get their job back or whatever it is, that's great. And it's certainly a possibility. But, you know, again, if their seller has a deal that they've got to complete on, they kind of don't have much of a choice, because they've got to go to their own seller and ask if they can have an extension because their buyer has lost their job and backed out. The other danger is that it's not just your deposit that you may be on the hook for. So if you agree to buy a property and you back out of that deal, either because you've lost your job or you just don't want to buy the property, or you think the market's dropping, if the market does drop, you know, and the seller, let's say you've agreed to buy a property for $300,000, the market drops and the seller can only sell it for $250,000. You know, you as the buyer that backed out of that contract to buy at $300,000, you're on the hook for the difference from the $300,000 you agreed to pay as compared to what the seller ended up getting for the property. So, you know, you really need to be, you know, that has to really be a last resort, that you breach the contract, because there's a whole lot of damages that can flow from it, and you don't know what those are going to be. It's not simply limited to the loss of your deposit. There may be a whole lot more. So, you know, if you have lost your job as a buyer, I'd say absolutely complete on the deal. You know, first, of course, you can explore the possibility with the seller of getting out of the deal. They may be actually hoping not to sell the property because they've realized they can't now buy the property they wanted to buy. You know, maybe they're moving to a different town for a new job. That's fallen through, or maybe they were sort of upgrading their house and they were going to buy something more expensive. Now they've realized they can't buy something more expensive. So it's not a bad idea, obviously, to use your realtor or your lawyer to explore the possibility of not completing at all with the seller. But if that isn't a possibility, or it's going to be expensive, I'd say complete on the deal, then figure out how to move forward. So, you know, typically the banks now are giving significant deferrals on mortgages. It's going to be expensive because all you're doing is essentially kicking that can down the road while it accrues interest. So you're going to be on the hook for that 6 months of interest. That adds up, and then your mortgage just gets extended longer. But I think that's better than losing your deposit. The other alternative is you make some change to your finances. You know, maybe if you can't afford this property, get some roommates, rent it out, do something different so that you can afford it. And, you know, the worst case scenario is if you really can't ever make your mortgage payments, the bank starts a foreclosure procedure, which, you know, even at the best of times takes a good year, probably more, before the foreclosure actually goes through and you have to move out of your house. So that gives you a whole lot of time for your economic circumstances to change. It gives you time to sell the house and move somewhere else to rent, whatever. But at least you haven't lost your deposit and you haven't been sued for some difference in the price you agreed to pay versus what the seller agreed to pay for it. So, you know, there's definitely options if you can't complete on a purchase. And there's, like I said, there's a whole lot of time from the time you buy the property until the time a bank actually forecloses on you and kicks you out of the property for you to figure out something different, for you to get your job back, for you to get a different job. And that way you haven't lost anything. You know, you haven't lost your deposit. You're not getting sued for a breach of contract.
That makes sense. And there's not as many unknowns there. It's actually cheaper to follow through it.
Yeah,
it really
absolutely.
is. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's talk about power of attorney and wills. I know this is off real estate, but it kind of ties into what's happening right now. Are you getting a lot of calls for wills and
Uh,
living wills, I would think, and that kind of stuff?
yes, we are, unfortunately, but this is the kind of thing that gets people
Mm,
thinking about their own mortality.
yep.
Um, and not just, mortality, but, what happens if they can't sign documents? Maybe somebody's in the middle of a refinance of their property and they get sick. They've got a rate hold on their mortgage till a certain time and they really need to get this new mortgage registered, but they can't because they're stuck back in Quebec taking care
Yeah.
of their parents. They can't see a notary there, um, or they get sick, whatever it is. So yeah, it's definitely a time that people are starting to think about, their their uh, their own, like I said, their own mortality. What's their estate plan, and how do they get their documents together? Given that it's pretty tough to get out of your house right now. So yeah, actually, that I've heard that the Attorney General is going to be changing the rules for, or at least I shouldn't say changing the rules, temporarily changing the rules for the execution of wills um, and powers of attorney, and that typically wills have to be signed in the presence of two adults, ideally unrelated adults who aren't your executor or any beneficiary. Um, but right now, because that's really difficult to find two kind of unrelated
Yeah.
uh, people. Like normally clients come into our office, into our boardroom, they sign their powers of attorney, they sign their wills. We've got a couple of staff to come in and witness the documents. It's pretty straightforward. But what we have been doing, there's a couple of options. One, we do, these sort of FaceTime or Zoom meetings. Another option, which is what we've been doing with real estate deals also, is just meeting the clients outside, outside their
Perfect.
house they sit on a bench or they sign, documents on the hood of their car, or somewhere in a public place, ideally that not a bench or railing that people have touched if they haven't been sterilized. But we meet people outside. It's probably safer. We stay 10 whatever feet away. We watch them sign. They leave the document. They have their own pen. They get back in their car with their pen. We'll go and pick up.
Perfect.
We'll go and pick up the papers. I'll witness them. We make sure our hands are all clean, and then we stick the papers, in a folder and in a drawer for a week or two, so that there's no chance of those papers being contaminated. And then
Oh,
everything's set. The real estate papers are signed in ink, at which I think ideally, if we can do that, that's the best way to do it, rather than Zoom meetings and that sort of thing. But I get that I don't necessarily want to meet with clients face to face if we don't absolutely have to, and clients,
yep.
the feeling is mutual. So
Absolutely.
we're able to, even with powers of attorney and wills now, we're able to do this. Even if the client doesn't have this sort of technology and it's just really impossible to meet with them, um, if we prepare the will for the client based on their instructions, we send them the will, they sign it, even if they have their spouse sign the will, or just anybody, or witness the will, or even anybody, or even if they can't get it witnessed, the fact that it's actually signed is doesn't make it a valid will, but it's the next best thing. And there's a process that we go through to, essentially have that will as valid as it can be. So it's definitely a good time to start thinking about that, updating your will if you haven't done it for a while. Look at who you've named as the guardians for your kids. Maybe that's changed. Maybe you made the will when the kids were 1 year old, and now they're 14, and it was your sister in downtown Toronto that was going to be the guardian, and that just doesn't make any sense anymore, because the kids have no interest in going and living in a 2-bedroom condo in downtown Toronto. They'd rather be at their place or near their place in Pemberton going to school, with their friends. And so then it's time to update your will and name different guardians who might be family friends or the kid's best friend's parents, whoever it is. We can definitely take instructions by email,
Oh,
Zoom,
great.
remotely by phone. We can go over all of this with clients by phone. Then we can have a quick, face-to-face meeting like this to make sure that they're really them, and they understand what's going on, and they're of sound mind and that kind of thing. And
Great.
then we get the documents done that way. And
Okay.
at worst, if there's a mistake in the witnessing, we weren't able to, get to their house to sign the will, or they couldn't come into the office, or we couldn't easily do it remotely like this, the best thing to do is just get the thing done, signed as best as possible, and then we can always come back and ratify it or sign it properly, once we're allowed out of the house again.
Which could be like 2 or 3 weeks from now, hopefully, maybe. I know. I've heard July, but we're always hopeful.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better to be optimistic about this stuff.
Right? And it's important to do. So I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about it right now.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and in terms of if you don't have a will,
yeah, what does that mean?
well, if you don't have, lots of people don't have wills. There's legislation that sets out what happens if you don't have a will. It doesn't mean necessarily that any more money goes to the government. What it does mean is that the government sets out your beneficiary structure. So the government says who inherits your money, which is your next of kin, which for most people, that's who they want to inherit their money, their husband or wife and their kids. But maybe they don't have a husband or wife. They've got, a best friend who they would actually want to inherit their money, and they've got a brother who they don't want to inherit their money either because they're not close to him. He's super well off, and they know that he doesn't need their money. They'd rather leave their money to charities, their friends, whoever it is, some cousin that they were close to when they were younger. If you don't have a will, the government doesn't know that that's who you wanted to leave your money to. So the government says your money goes to your brother. And like I said, for most people, most people leave their money to their families, often in a similar way to what the government structure is. But many people don't, and the only way to make sure that your money goes to who you want it to go to is to have a will and set it out in the will. And one of the, in terms of, like I was sort of alluding to before about how, the government doesn't really take any more or less of your tax money. They don't, your capital gains taxes are going to be the same, typically, no matter who you leave your money to. The probate fees are going to be similar no matter who you leave your money to. But typically what we do when clients meet with us is we go through what their financial situation is, what their assets are, how they hold title to them, and make sure that they've got their affairs set up in such a way that they can pass their assets to their next of kin in the most tax efficient way possible. Because there's a lot of people that, they're married, they've been married for a long time, but they still have their own assets, their own bank accounts. Maybe the wife's name is on title to the house because 25 years ago, the husband was a builder and didn't want his name on anything. Maybe the wife bought the house before she even met the husband, and they've just never updated that. So the problem with that is if the wife passes away, sure, the husband gets the house either through the will, or if you don't have a will, just by virtue of the intestacy rules. But in that case, the estate's paying probate taxes on that house for no reason, because all you had to do is put the husband on title to the house. It's a tax-free maneuver, and then you avoid probate fees, and you make things a lot easier and more efficient and simpler on your family. So that's, you can definitely do a will yourself. You can if you want to do the homework and figure out how to do it, it's not difficult, but at the same time, what's important is it's not just the piece of paper and doing that properly. It's looking at the whole situation, your whole financial situation and your beneficiary structure, and making sure that to the extent possible, you've set things up so that your estate and your beneficiaries can avoid paying taxes that they don't necessarily need to pay if you set up your assets and how you hold title to them in a better way.
I would think it's important to talk to a professional, especially if you have assets, a home, all of these things. Nobody thinks of these things, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, and it can definitely save problems in terms of who your executor is. If often you want a certain person, your son to be your executor, but not your daughter, for whatever reason. But if you don't name somebody in a will, then anybody can apply to be your executor. It doesn't have to be a close family member. It can be anybody. The court still has to accept that, and typically it's the probably the best person for the job, but it might not be. And it's one of these things that if you name your executor, then it's clear that that's who you want to do it. It's not just whoever happened to be, closest in proximity to you, or
Right.
the one who can convince a judge that they're the best person for the job, even if they really may not be the best person for the job, or at least not the person that you wanted to do it.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. So, well, thank you, Sholto. Any advice going forward for anybody? I know it's crazy times.
I don't know. It's great. Everything changes every day. I think generally, you want to act reasonably, understand everybody's situation who's involved in the transaction with you, understand what the rules are, and get everything to the extent possible in writing, from your bank. Get that mortgage commitment before you
Yes.
remove your subject conditions. Talk to your lawyer about the will. Don't just assume that this is how things happen, because this is how things happen, in Australia where you used to live, or this is what happened in Ontario when your dad passed away. Things change. Things are different in different jurisdictions, and it's definitely just make sure you're informed before you make any significant decisions. And I know it's difficult in times like these where things change so quickly, and the rug gets pulled out from under you sometimes pretty quickly in terms of jobs and financing and that kind of thing. But try as to the extent possible not to make any rash decisions, and definitely get professional advice before you make any of those decisions.
Okay, that sounds like good advice. Thank you, Sholto.
You're welcome.
That was great.
Cool. Thank you.
Just hang on. Yes, if you